Just 3 minutes ago, the palace trembled not from an external threat, but from a name. Princess Anne. The woman once known for her stoic silence has broken ranks. And what she revealed wasn't just gossip, it was a bombshell. A hidden alliance between Queen Camilla and Prince Andrew. A deal buried so deep within royal corridors, it was never meant to surface. Until now. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was meant to be just another formal gathering, a routine briefing with a few senior aides, an afternoon lull in the palace's daily schedule. But Anne, ever the quiet sentinel, walked into the press room at Clarence House without announcement, without escort, and without hesitation. What she carried wasn't just paper, it was a declaration of war on deceit. As reporters scrambled to understand what was unfolding before them, Anne delivered her exposé with the cold precision of a woman who'd waited too long to stay silent. Her words sliced through the room like icy glass. In a voice devoid of theatrics but rich with fury, she named names, dates, and meetings. And at the heart of it all, Camilla and Andrew. Allies in secret. Co-conspirators in a deal that threatened to fracture the very image of the monarchy. This wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't gossip whispered behind palace walls. This was calculated. And most terrifyingly, it was backed by evidence. She hinted not just at wrongdoing but at a long-standing betrayal rooted in an underground struggle for influence, power, and survival. For years, factions had been growing beneath the glossy surface of royal unity. But what Anne laid bare suggested something far more dangerous, a covert shift of power that could alter the balance within the family forever. Anne's expression didn't waver, even as gasps filled the room. There were no elaborate accusations, just raw, unfiltered truth that she'd kept locked away for far too long. And now, with the nation watching and the palace utterly unprepared, the truth was out. She closed her file, took one step back, and said just 6 words that stunned the entire kingdom: it was never just about Andrew. Those words carried weight far heavier than the moment could hold. They hinted at years of manipulation. A deep-rooted game where allies were chosen, enemies made, and silence bought. The monarchy's illusion of unity had just been shattered in real time. But this wasn't just about scandal, it was about payback. Anne had waited patiently as Camilla rose in influence, as Andrew lingered in the shadows, and as secrets continued to pile up behind closed doors. Now, she'd decided enough was enough. The price of silence had become too steep, and she was ready to burn the carefully painted fade down. But to understand why Anne chose to detonate this time bomb now, we need to go back to the beginning of a royal rivalry few dared to confront. The world saw civility, smiles, small talk. But behind closed doors, Princess Anne and Camilla's relationship was anything but cordial. For years, Camilla occupied the space once reserved for a sisterhood only to fill it with distrust, passive slights, and veiled threats. The tension wasn't sudden, it was sculpted, moment by moment, betrayal by betrayal. From the moment Camilla was brought into the fold, Anne had felt the shift. She, the no-nonsense daughter of the queen, raised in duty and draped in discipline, watched as this once scandalous outsider began to slide into a role she was never meant to have. Anne didn't speak often, but when she did, her words cut with precision. And from the beginning, she warned that Camilla's rise wasn't out of love, it was a play for influence. Where Anne had served with unwavering loyalty, Camilla navigated with charm, maneuvering through cracks in the monarchy's foundation like water seeking its level. It wasn't long before Anne noticed the deference shown to Camilla behind palace walls. A shift in tone, a change in language, a subtle rearrangement of power. Anne was no stranger to politics, but what troubled her was the silence from Charles, the man who once leaned on her judgment, now seemed clouded by emotion, or worse, manipulation. Camilla had done what few thought possible. She'd not only entered the royal machine, she was redefining its hierarchy. To the public, they stood together at events, exchanged pleasantries, shared stiff photo moments. But those brief glances, the cold nods, the calculated space between their bodies, all told a very different story. Anne never needed to say much. Her disapproval was loud in its stillness. Her loyalty wasn't to individuals but to the crown, and she watched as Camilla's influence spread, infecting decision-making at every level. There were moments Anne remembered sharply, occasions where Camilla, ever the performer, delivered pointed remarks masked in jest, subtle challenges to Anne's authority wrapped in smiles. And as Camilla grew bolder, Anne grew more alert. She began to keep records, dates, comments, changes in access. There was always a new aid being shifted, a long-standing protocol being relaxed. An unexpected name invited to an inner circle event. Anne knew what it looked like, consolidation of power under the guise of modernizing the monarchy. But no one dared say it aloud. Not yet. And then came the whispers. Low conversations in forgotten hallways, staff shifting uncomfortably when Anne walked past. A joke made in a servant's quarters about two queens under one roof. The realization hit Anne like a thunderclap. Camilla wasn't merely adjusting to royal life. She was staging a quiet takeover. And worse, the institution was letting her. In her mother's reign, this would have been unthinkable. But now, it was becoming normalized. With every ignored warning, Anne's frustration deepened. Her once cautious neutrality was now brewing into something fierce. She didn't just see a woman pushing boundaries, she saw a threat being legitimized. Still, Anne played the long game. She watched. She waited. She collected. Not because she feared Camilla, but because she knew that revealing the truth too soon could backfire. But underneath her composed exterior, a war was being waged. And the longer it went unchecked, the more dangerous the consequences became. But even Anne, with all her sharp instincts, couldn't predict just how far Camilla would go or who she'd partner with. Prince Andrew's exile was complete, or so the public thought. But power, once tasted, is rarely surrendered. And someone was about to give him a second chance. Someone unexpected. Someone with an agenda. Enter Camilla. In the aftermath of his public disgrace, Andrew was supposed to fade quietly into the background. Stripped of royal patronages, pushed from ceremonial duties, and cast out from the royal spotlight, he became the embodiment of scandal the monarchy wished to forget. But behind palace walls, silence is rarely the same as surrender. Andrew, humiliated yet unyielding, was far from ready to disappear. He began planting roots in private spaces, discreet conversations, carefully chosen dinner guests, subtle appearances in social circles, where influence still whispered his name. While the public turned their backs, Andrew never stopped looking for a way back in. And just as he began to drift further into obscurity, Camilla stepped into the shadows beside him. It started with small gestures, an unannounced visit to one of Andrew's private estates, a message passed through a longtime confidante, a shared sentiment about being misunderstood by the institution they'd both spent their lives inside. On the surface, nothing appeared out of place, but beneath it, something calculating was beginning to stir. Camilla, now queen consort, wasn't just building her image, she was cementing her influence. And Andrew, isolated and desperate, was the perfect pawn. Rumors began to swirl within palace corridors. Staff reported seeing vehicles not listed on official schedules arriving at Andrew's property during peculiar hours. A former aide, known for their discretion, was suddenly reassigned only to be spotted weeks later entering Clarence's house through a side entrance. These weren't coincidences. These were signs. Anne noticed. She always did. The subtle shifts in personnel. The re-emergence of names long buried by scandal. The renewed presence of Andrew's closest advisors, all of it pointed to something being orchestrated. Quietly. Strategically. Reports began leaking snippets of confidential meetings, coded emails, whispers from sources who feared retribution. But all roads pointed to the same conclusion: Camilla was maneuvering. She wasn't rehabilitating Andrew. She was recruiting him. For what purpose, no one yet knew. But to Anne, the answer was clear. This wasn't about forgiveness or redemption. This was about leverage. Camilla needed someone on the inside, someone with dirt, desperation, and motive. Andrew checked every box. And he, in turn, saw Camilla as a lifeline back to relevance. Their interests aligned. Their loyalty didn't lie with the crown, it lay with themselves. What had once seemed unthinkable, a disgraced prince and a controversial queen aligning behind closed doors, was now happening in real time. Slowly, secretly, and dangerously. Anne's instincts screamed that something bigger was on the horizon. something that could threaten the monarchy's already fragile reputation. She had spent a lifetime protecting the family from implosion. But this alliance was unlike anything she had seen before. And then, like a serpent sliding through cracks in the crown, the deal itself took shape. A pact signed in silence. An agreement that would never survive the light. But Anne found it buried in the archives, sealed by Camilla's aid, and traced to a private estate meeting. The details weren't just damning, they were dangerous. It began, as all dangerous things do, in shadows. A quiet meeting at a countryside estate, off royal schedules, invisible to press or protocol. Camilla, dressed not as a queen but as a confidante, arrived without guards. Andrew, stripped of titles but still wielding secrets like currency, was already there. What passed between them that day wasn't just conversation, it was strategy. In exchange for his silence and loyalty, Camilla offered something few believed could ever be returned to Andrew: royal relevance. Not the full reinstatement the public would revolt over, but something far more insidious, a role from the inside, just under the surface, where no one could see him move, but his influence would quietly stretch across palace affairs. Anne uncovered the first trace by accident, a slip in correspondence between Camilla's longtime aide and an administrative figure Anne had worked with during her mother's reign. The language was vague, but the tone unmistakably urgent. Dates aligned too neatly. Messages marked for your eyes only showed up with strange frequency between Clarence's house and Andrew's private residence. She didn't confront. She observed. She followed. And she waited. With the help of a discreet royal staffer, an old ally of Queen Elizabeth who owed his allegiance to no one but the crown itself, Anne pieced together a web of communications that led her to a locked drawer in a retired aide's office. Inside it was a red file. Unofficial. Unlogged. Unforgettable. What lay within the pages wasn't simply evidence, it was a blueprint for manipulation. Camilla had orchestrated a pathway for Andrew's subtle re-entry into royal affairs, disguising his influence through third-party consultations, charitable advisory roles, and private correspondence with international figures who still referred to him by his former titles. In return, Andrew pledged something more valuable than loyalty: access to memories, to secrets, to weaknesses within the monarchy's inner workings that Camilla had never been fully allowed into. And more than anything, to intelligence about those standing in her way. It was clear Camilla wasn't just propping up Andrew. She was building a faction. One she could control. One that operated outside Charles's cautious reach. With Charles aging and his grip on power quietly weakening behind the scenes, Camilla saw an opportunity to carve her own line of power within the monarchy, parallel to the official throne. And Andrew was the first brick in that foundation. A disgraced prince turned inside agent. It wasn't redemption. It was rebellion. A silent coup, dressed as royal cooperation. Anne's heart pounded as she read the final page. It was signed only with initials, but the timing and phrasing were irrefutable. This was no coincidence. This was no misunderstanding. This was a calculated attempt to undermine the balance of the royal family by weaponizing scandal, rewriting allegiances, and masking ambition as forgiveness. Anne sat in silence, knowing what this meant. Not just for Camilla, not just for Andrew, but for William, for Catherine, for the legacy of the crown itself. But secrets of this scale don't stay silent forever, especially when they threaten the very line of succession. When Prince William learned fragments of the pact, he confronted his father. The future king met the present monarch with urgency and fire. But Charles stayed silent. What was he protecting? Or worse, whom? The moment William pieced together the whispers, Camilla's late-night meetings, Andrew's reappearance in private court circles, and the quiet rearrangement of palace roles, his instinct wasn't to hesitate. It was to demand the truth. He arrived at Sandringham unannounced, bypassing aides, ignoring custom, and walking straight into the room where his father sat reading in solitude. The air shifted. William's voice, usually measured and composed, broke with fury. He laid it bare. He knew there was a deal. He knew Camilla had made a move. And he knew Andrew was at the center of it. But what stunned him more than the betrayal was the silence that followed. Charles didn't deny it. He didn't react. He simply stared. Frozen. And in that stillness, William felt something worse than confrontation. He felt complicity. Was his father afraid, protecting the woman who had already changed the course of his reign? Or was it something darker, an acceptance that power plays were part of the throne's survival, even if it meant turning a blind eye? William left that meeting with more questions than answers, but one thing had crystallized: trust had shattered. The monarchy that demanded obedience from him his entire life had hidden a scheme that threatened its very integrity. And at the center of it, two names kept echoing: Camilla and Andrew. That night, William reached out to the one person whose judgment he trusted beyond doubt. Not an advisor, not a peer, his Aunt Anne. They met in private, far from the palace walls, and there she showed him everything. The files, the messages, the signatures, the evidence of a silent rebellion carried out under the guise of royal preservation. William listened, stunned into silence, not by what had happened, but by how long it had been allowed to fester. For the first time, he realized how isolated he'd become within his own family. Camilla had outmaneuvered him. Andrew had positioned himself back into the game, and his father, his king, had said nothing. In the days that followed, subtle shifts became unmistakable. William's public appearances with Camilla grew colder. He declined joint engagements. Advisors began whispering about his refusal to sign off on certain internal decisions that had previously passed without resistance. Behind palace gates, a quiet war was emerging, one not of declarations, but of distance. The bond between heir and monarch had cracked. The image of unity was becoming impossible to maintain. And outside those gates, the public began to notice. Something was changing. The House of Windsor, once so tightly choreographed, was unraveling at the seams. But this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the climax. Because the final blow didn't come from William, Charles, or even the press. It came from the woman who had stayed silent the longest. Until now. Princess Anne had endured enough. Watching her mother's legacy be twisted, watching alliances form in the shadows, it all reached a breaking point. The final betrayal wasn't the deal, it was who Camilla tried to bring in next. Zara Tindall was never meant to be part of the game. Unburdened by royal titles, free from the suffocating weight of duty, Anne had fought to keep her daughter beyond the storm. But storms have a way of creeping in through cracks. It began with a seemingly harmless invitation, an exclusive event, organized quietly through one of Andrew's trusted intermediaries. Zara, well-respected, apolitical, and beloved for her independence, was approached not with pressure, but with praise. They spoke of influence, of legacy, of how her unique voice could help modernize the monarchy from within. It sounded flattering. But to Anne, it reeked of something far more sinister. When Zara mentioned it during a casual conversation over tea, Anne's blood ran cold. The names involved, the phrasing used, the timing, it was all too calculated. This wasn't an invitation. It was an infiltration. Camilla was trying to co-opt Zara, to bring her into a network Anne had already exposed as deceitful and dangerous. Anne didn't hesitate. She pressed for details. Zara, caught off guard, shared everything she could remember. And with every word, Anne's fury grew. It wasn't just political maneuvering anymore, it was personal. Anne, who had remained silent through Charles's compromises, through Camilla's ascension, through Andrew's quiet re-emergence, finally reached her limit. There were lines she had been willing to tolerate for the sake of the crown. But this was an invasion of her family, her blood, her daughter. And for that, Camilla had crossed the final line. Anne's rage didn't come in outbursts, it came in cold, steady waves. Controlled, calculated, and irreversible. She called upon her most trusted confidante, a retired official who had once served Queen Elizabeth with unwavering loyalty. That night, in hushed tones over documents and timelines, Anne laid out everything she had uncovered. And for the first time, she said it aloud. I have to go public. There was no press team involved, no palace approval. Anne knew this couldn't be filtered. If she allowed the palace to touch it, it would vanish, rewritten or buried. She made the call herself. One to a journalist she had trusted for years. One to a security aide who would ensure she could speak uninterrupted. And one to her daughter to warn her, to shield her, and to make clear none of this was Zara's fault. She wasn't stepping forward to create chaos. She was stepping forward because silence had become complicity. Anne had grown up living by one rule: protect the crown. But that rule was written when the crown meant honor, not manipulation. The moment it became a weapon wielded behind closed doors, Anne understood her duty had shifted. She wasn't protecting the crown anymore. She was protecting its soul. And if that meant burning the system that had betrayed its people from within, so be it. And so, the royal press room lights turned on, and the monarchy held its breath. It happened fast. Princess Anne, flanked by 2 aides, walked into the media room without warning. Reporters froze, cameras scrambled. And then, the words fell like thunder. Names, dates, motives. It was no longer speculation, it was war. The media room at Clarence House had never witnessed anything like it. One moment it was quiet, prepped for the usual briefing by a palace spokesperson. The next, Princess Anne appeared at the entrance with a steel expression and a red folder clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't pause. She didn't smile. She walked straight to the podium without introduction, nodded once to the stunned room, and began speaking in a voice that shook the very air. No teleprompters, no scripts, just truth unfiltered, unflinching, and aimed like a dagger at the heart of the monarchy's illusion. She began with names, not vague insinuations, not polite language. Camilla, Andrew. She spoke them with the same clipped authority she had carried her entire life, but this time it was loaded with betrayal. Then came the dates, precise, irrefutable, marked by documents she pulled from her folder like evidence in a criminal trial. Reporters, initially frozen in shock, scrambled to record. Pens flew. Shutters clicked. Broadcasts cut live to the feed without clearance. What Anne was saying wasn't just news, it was history unraveling. She laid it all out. The meetings, the intermediaries, the messages passed through aides and disguised as logistical memos. A deal forged in secrecy, aimed at installing a power structure beneath the king's nose. And then she raised the stakes. She named the royal aide who had come forward, an individual with decades of service, who had watched in silence as Camilla and Andrew spun their web. This aide, sworn to confidentiality under Queen Elizabeth's reign, had finally broken ranks to protect the monarchy's future. Gasps filled the room. One reporter stood and asked the question no one wanted to voice. "Your Royal Highness, what does this mean for the crown?" Anne didn't flinch. She looked the journalist squarely in the eye and answered, "It means the institution must choose between survival and self-destruction. And it begins with truth." Behind the cameras, palace aides scrambled. Phones lit up. Advisors whispered frantically in corners, completely blindsided. No one had authorized this. No one had even known it was coming. Within minutes, headlines exploded across the globe. Princess Anne exposes Camilla-Andrew alliance. Monarchy in crisis, shock statement from the Princess Royal. Social media imploded. Hashtags trended worldwide. For the first time in decades, a senior royal had publicly broken the code of silence, and not on behalf of the crown, but against it. And yet, despite the chaos, Anne remained composed. She had said what needed to be said. But just as it seemed she was finished, just as the weight of her revelation settled across the room, Anne delivered one final sentence that sucked the breath from every lung. "There's something else," she said. "Something still hidden. And it changes everything." But Anne wasn't finished. Her final sentence hinted at something even darker, something not yet revealed. Anne ended her statement with a riddle. "There's more, and it involves something that should have never left Balmoral." The room went silent. What was stolen? What was hidden? What truth was darker than betrayal itself? Reporters, already stunned by the magnitude of Anne's declaration, found themselves paralyzed once more. This wasn't just about Camilla and Andrew anymore. It wasn't just about power grabs or silent conspiracies. Anne had pointed to Balmoral, the private sanctuary of the late Queen Elizabeth II, the place where monarchy stripped itself of ceremony and retreated into raw, unguarded tradition. If something had gone missing from Balmoral, and if that something was tied to the Queen's final months, then the implications were catastrophic. The room buzzed with tension. But Anne offered no further details. Just that cryptic phrase, etched in ice, "It should have never left." Whispers erupted as the press exited the room. Theories multiplied at a fever pitch. Royal insiders speculated about private letters, unreleased recordings, sealed documents authored by the Queen before her passing, perhaps a final instruction, or a correction to the established line of succession. Some even suggested that the Queen had left behind a confidential file detailing her concerns about Camilla's expanding influence. Whatever it was, Anne clearly believed its absence had altered the balance of royal power. The suspicion that Camilla and Andrew not only knew of its existence but orchestrated its disappearance added a dangerous new dimension to the already spiraling scandal. What made it worse was Balmoral's sacred reputation. For generations, it was the royal family's inner sanctum, untouched by politics, guarded by silence, preserved by history. But now that very place had become the heart of a brewing storm. Anne's words were calculated. She didn't name the item, she didn't name the culprit, but her implication was clear, and her refusal to elaborate not yet sent a darker message. She was holding something back, something that could fracture the monarchy even further. Royal staff scrambled to double-check archive logs. Advisors demanded access to restricted files. But the truth, whatever it was, remained locked away, known only to Anne. And, perhaps, those she accused. Camilla vanished from public view. Andrew reportedly left one of his private estates under urgent protection orders. King Charles canceled 2 scheduled engagements and retreated behind closed doors at Windsor, issuing no statement. Silence had become the loudest alarm. In living rooms across Britain, televisions replayed Anne's final words on a loop. Commentators speculated. Journalists analyzed every syllable. Online platforms lit up with theories, conspiracies, and desperate pleas for clarity. But Anne gave them nothing more. She'd said enough to shake the palace and just enough to leave it dangling on a knife's edge. She had opened the door to something darker, something buried. And now the entire institution stood trembling in its shadow. And as the palace braces for a second wave of revelations, one question remains. How much more will Anne reveal, and will the monarchy survive it? In the hours after Anne's statement, royal advisors rushed behind the scenes. Camilla disappeared from public view. Andrew was reportedly escorted from a private estate. But this isn't a resolution, it's the first domino. And it's already falling. Within minutes of Anne's explosive press conference, the palace was in chaos. Phones rang non-stop, aides whispered in corridors, and the royal crisis team was mobilized faster than it had been in years. The Queen Consort's schedule vanished without explanation, her upcoming appearances canceled, her public engagements indefinitely postponed. No statement, no apology, just silence. Camilla, the woman who had once commanded attention with every carefully planned move, was now nowhere to be found. Behind palace walls, legal teams huddled, not just to assess the damage, but to prepare for what might still come. If Anne was holding back more, as she'd made chillingly clear, the risk wasn't just reputational, it was existential. Meanwhile, Andrew's camp moved quickly. A carefully worded denial emerged through a longtime family spokesperson, claiming the prince had no involvement in any inappropriate agreements, and remains committed to supporting the monarchy in a private capacity. But the words rang hollow. The public wasn't buying it. Online, support for Princess Anne surged at an unprecedented rate. She was hailed as the guardian of her mother's legacy, the last unbending pillar in a royal structure riddled with cracks. Social media exploded with hashtags like #StandWithAnne and #SaveTheCrown. Across news networks, anchors questioned everything from the future of Charles's reign to the silence from within Windsor itself. Inside the palace, the pressure on King Charles was mounting by the hour. Courtiers begged for a response. Parliament murmured about constitutional stability. Senior royals debated whether Charles could remain passive as the world demanded action. Yet he said nothing. Whether out of shock, fear, or internal turmoil, his voice remained absent, allowing Anne's to echo louder and longer than anyone anticipated. And that echo wasn't fading. It was spreading. This wasn't the end of a scandal. This was the unraveling of an era. A house once bound by tradition and secrecy now stood exposed under the weight of betrayal, silence, and ambition. The monarchy hadn't yet fallen, but it had staggered. And the people who once defended its every move now questioned its every decision. Trust was no longer implicit. Respect was no longer guaranteed. The crown was still standing, yes, but not without visible fractures. And behind those fractures, something more dangerous loomed. The possibility of more truths, more betrayals, more consequences yet to be revealed. The documentary closes with the voiceover. The crown isn't broken yet, but the glue has cracked. Subscribe for updates. We'll be watching as Anne's next move could either save the monarchy or burn it down. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.